Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Design and Dialogue with Mass Design Group. Today I'll be speaking with old friend Michael Murphy and Christian Benimana from Mass Design Group's Boston and Kigali offices. We're so excited to have you guys here with us today and to hear about your practice and to hear how life is these days. Welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Welcome, Christian.
Thanks for having me.
So, you know, I know that I know that I know your work very well, and we're looking at 10 years of Mass Design Group. I think you were a little over 10 years now, right? Founded in 2008, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. 2008 to 2009. It's sort of a
okay. I mean, I think what for me sets your practice apart is the focus on design for justice and design for dignity. I'm just curious. I mean, as we start out, maybe we could just talk a little bit about the origins of Mass Design Group, and I mean, maybe, you know, this idea of can buildings heal is sort of where you began, and the practice has just grown and progressed into so many different kinds of projects that are dealing with really the big issues of our time. And I think that there are very few architectural practices in the world that are approaching architecture in this way. So during this hour that we have together, with everyone calling in from around the world, I want to talk about the ways that your practice is unique, the ways that you know, you engage collaborators and work on a range of things that look at this aspect of beauty from through a different lens, through the lens of justice and through the lens of dignity. And so I'm wondering, Michael, if you could start us off with what does MASS, M-A-S-S, stand for? And maybe that's a good place for us to start talking about the practice.
Yeah, right on. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having us, and excited to be able to chat with you all today. And I hope it is a conversation, and less a lecture. So I'm sharing my screen here, if that's the right move, just to answer your question. Is that cool? So yeah, MASS stands for, actually it is an acronym. It stands for a model of architecture that serves society. And in that is, I think, really centering the notion of service as integral to the work of the built environment, that it's a role of accompaniment or proximity or adjacency to groups, organizations, community members, nonprofit organizations, activists, organizations that are trying to change the world, change their organizations, change their communities, and they can't do it without thinking critically about the space around them. In this way, space and the redesign and reconfiguration of space is always inherently a part of questions of social, environmental, economic justice, and it's a political conversation. And it's not only a conversation of form, it's a conversation of process. And I think we've come to this through a real, I would say, a philosophy that design decisions aren't neutral decisions. They're always, in some form or another, affecting our lives and shaping our lives. There's active debate about this idea within design circles, whether it should or could. I think that conversation is important to talk about at what level and at what frame or at what kind of intensity is architecture and design hurting or healing us. But I think the idea is that it isn't ever just neutrally being a place where people can or organizations just sit and things happen. It is shaping us, it's shaping behavior. And I think while this was a provocation 12 or 15 years ago, not ours alone, I mean, we stand on the shoulders of so many others who've made this same claim for generations, going all the way back to, let's call it William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, to others who would advocate for this. I think now, in the middle of this pandemic, where all of us are in the prisons of our own homes or closed in our apartments and, wondering whether we should open the door to the hallway or the window to the outside, here is a paradigmatic example of how the spaces around us are shaping our daily lives and our ability to get access to what we might call like a fundamental human right, which is the right to breathe. Yeah. I would call it a higher right than the right to health. The right to breathe and access to breath, uncontaminated air, is maybe quite possibly the dominant driver of all space decisions. And in fact, I think informs every building. And if we take seriously, suggests that architecture is in the realm of rights. It's not in the realm. It's also in the realm of rights as well as in the realm of dignity. And that there's a real, I think, deep meaning to that we're all encountering at the moment.
Yeah. Well, to speak about right to architecture, it takes me back to your origins with Dr. Paul Farmer, right? And so the idea that you were studying at Harvard, and you hear this doctor speaking about the right to architecture, and just to frame it in that way, I think led you to some very conscious decisions about how you would work and how you would structure Mass Design Group. So can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, let me talk about this one. I'd love to, have Christian jump in here, but that's right. I mean, I think when we met Dr. Farmer, he was talking about buildings in the realm of rights, right to access to healthcare. And, they were asking questions that were not just, could we afford to have architecture and design, but they were asking questions like, what is the cost of not having architecture and design? What's the cost of not having the spaces around us considered for the people that they serve? And it brought up this example, which we use a lot, but I think it really changed the way I understood built environment, this is Tugela Ferry, South Africa, where in 2005, the outbreak of extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis emerged in this hospital outside of Durban. And the reason it emerged in this hospital, something I think we all know now, is because patients waited in this hallway that was unventilated, co-infected each other as they were breathing and coughing on each other. And one drug-resistant strand met another drug-resistant strand to create an extremely drug-resistant strand. And then you have this pandemic that emerges because the spatial conditions weren't designed for infection control. This is a hospital, but now we're facing that in every space around the world. I mean, it suggests that this is the crisis. And I think in simple design solutions could have been implemented to mitigate this. And yet this access, this service was not available. This spatial awareness or the spatial vocabulary, spatial services or needs weren't available. And I think that need is evident around the world in all of our communities. And trying to solve for how we provide that service in new and in ways, regardless of whether there's an RFP or regardless of whether there's even a paying client, but to provide that service as an essential service. I think that's fundamentally the question we were trying to answer. And I think many architects and designers are trying to answer, and we tried to answer through this structure.
I think it really had a lot to do with your relationship to that first, let's say, partner. And Dr. Farmer, it's Partners in Health, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, and just, I mean, when I think about the idea of, we of course, we know we have a history of, let's say, external forces entering into other countries trying to help. But to frame it as a partnership, right? Partners in Health, I think is a very interesting way to look at it. And I think it also must have influenced how you see your practice in architecture. And when I spoke about the structure of your firm, I wanted to hear a little bit about the fact that you are a nonprofit, and Mass Design Group is a nonprofit, and why you made that decision.
Well, maybe Christian can answer that first question about like this, the first project and like why Rwanda, and then I can talk about the structure a little bit if that's of interest.
So thanks, Michael. No, but I think Stephen brings up a very important point about the kind of like change of dynamics when the idea of partnership is introduced. Because many of these challenges faced by our profession that Michael just eloquently pointed out, and these like like structural challenges to our being that we need to wrestle with to be able to address these challenges are made worse when we start working in resources limited settings like Rwanda, and where sometimes the relationships that we develop in situations where we're asked to intervene and provide with these situations is confronted by this reality, whether you call it like a fact of reality of life, or conceived or perceived reality, that there's not enough, and therefore you have to prioritize, you have to choose, you have to do these things. And I think that idea of partnerships is the one that changes things a little bit and says, if it's a partnership, then we need to figure out the best thing to do first, and then figure out the right partners to be on the table to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And I think this first project in Rwanda, the Butaro Hospital, was a perfect demonstration of what the right partnerships can achieve when the right goal setting takes priority before resources limitations. But in addition to that, also like the right partnerships also helps to point out that what's been branded the resources limitation is not a resources limitation. Like in Butaro, because of exactly like the resources limitations, like that has forced that partnership to come up with more innovative solutions to answer some of these bigger questions. And then starts also challenging the ideas that the solutions to everything is abundance of solutions, because then that's also like create this side effect that we don't tend to address, that I think Michael calls like a paralysis of choices, and just end up like getting stuck into this repetitive way of doing things because it's what's comfortable for us, and we never want to step out of that realm of like comfort to be able to address real situations. And I think Butaro is a demonstration of those two main things, is that innovation is not limited to where resources are. That's number one. And two, what is so branded sometimes, like what is often branded as resources limitation is actually a source of inspiration that can actually transform how we think about things, but also like what solutions that we bring.
Yeah, I think just to jump in on that really eloquent point, Christian, the research for this hospital was around how can we reconfigure the space to reduce airborne transmission of disease. So this hospital there's like no hallways in the hospital, for example, because we learned from these lessons. It's very rural and remote. We couldn't have, the way we would solve that in the US is massive mechanical systems, negative pressure rooms, giant air handling systems. And, in this condition, we knew that those big technocratic solutions break. They're hard to maintain. They're hard to repair. And sometimes when they fail worse than they would if you didn't have them at all. So instead, looking within that context, buildings used to be able to breathe in such a way that TB and other airborne diseases weren't transmitted. So couldn't we just go back to some of the ways in which buildings were thought about carefully for climate and context and historically?
Right.
And that research, not just a kind of nostalgia, but actually thinking critically about air movement, drove the design of this campus and changed it from a big hospital, singular building, to a multi-building campus. It changed it from huge, wide, thick floor plates to thin ones. Changed it from sections that were tall ceilinged and had really calibrated window openings. And that research also has driven us to completely rethink all buildings from that point on, and to today, be very present in thinking about COVID response and retrofits to our spaces that we're in around us. That very same research has been a kind of driving philosophy about the way buildings affect our health, affect our behavior, and how we can do simple calibrations to change that.
Of course, you had no idea that your experience something like 13 years ago would be informing the work that you're doing today and leading the field and work with your COVID response in architecture. I'd love for you to take us back, though, and give us a little more context, Michael, around how Botaro came to be and those kind of the primary motivators for what would become your practice today.
Yeah, well, and maybe again, I can do this with Christian. I think you got to set the context for like both the partnership and the place. In 2008, and we write a little bit about this in our book, but 2008 was, of course, the financial collapse of the, at least the U.S. and a lot of the neoliberal global marketplace, and it was incubated by a housing collapse, another spatial reason and crisis. And of course, architects were some of the first to lose their jobs. So when I went into architecture school, everyone was like, flush with work. When in the middle of it, no one had work at all. Yet there were certain economies that were insulated from that crisis, Rwanda being one of them, which wasn't deeply invested in a kind of diverse neoliberal marketplace. They were investing in their own economy. They're investing in healthcare, investing in education. And they were actually building, they were growing, they were putting resources back into the country and bringing in partnerships to assist in rethinking things from the ground up.
And it should be said, only 14 years after the genocide, right? So that's really...
The genocide against the Tutsi was 14 years prior, and Partners in Health was brought in as a partner to think with the government about a new health system strengthening plan with the Ministry of Health. And they were asked as an organization, and they had done that kind of health systems work in other places, Malawi, Haiti, of course, in Russia, in a number of other countries. But this was one of their largest initiatives, and they were asked after a successful pilot in the southeast in the country in a town called Rinkwavu, to launch a new ground up medical facility from scratch in the northern part of the country, in this very remote, gorgeous, beautiful area, but very, very remote in terms of access to healthcare, and to build a purpose-built medical facility. This at the time would be the largest facility they would build. And keep in mind, as a nonprofit partnered with the Ministry of Health, they were raising the capital to build it, and then as soon as it was built, it was donated to the Ministry of Health. So this is a government hospital. It's not a private facility. Now, Christian, you want to add any other, color to the context that we're talking about?
No, I guess I think
I'd love to know where you were at that time when things were beginning there for Michael.
I was finishing my school years in Shanghai, China.
Oh, wow. Wow. Very unexpected. Interesting.
Yeah, a whole story for another time, I guess. But I think that the only thing that I would add on to what Michael is talking about is that as he pointed out, that there was this conflicting information about also what the country was doing and continues to do at this point in time. One of the things that maybe can help answer the question that Michael just posed, like why Rwanda, and you also like brought up, like why mass, start this in Rwanda, is because it became very apparent right following the 1994 genocide against Tutsis that for a community to rebuild from that point so low in our lives, we're not going to rely on conventional methodology for development to be able to reach the point we want to get to as fast as we wanted to get to, as well as we wanted to get to.
Sure.
And I think that that understanding also parallels or has fueled a lot of our thinking en masse about, how we need to understand our own work, and maybe Michael will also touch on this later, about our own structure as an organization, to push it in the realm of unconventional ways to try to respond to these challenges as much as possible, because we learned that lesson from this space where we were being bombarded with this type of really challenging ideals from an environment that did not show any indication of supporting any form of conventional solutions to thrive and provide results.
And I have to say that we tend to, I guess the origins of architecture were very much social, right? Very much in service of society, let's say. But I would argue that the 20th century created a kind of architecture in service of capital. And, this return to an architecture in service of society in a context like Rwanda, I think is very, I guess it took a certain number of conditions coming together to make that a reality. I'd imagine it would have been a much more difficult project had it started in America, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally, sorry, I was unmuting. I think you're totally correct. There's like that awkward delay. I think you're totally correct. I mean, architecture has always had a foundation in what some would call a social project. Although I would even challenge the idea that there is an unsocial architecture. I mean, what is that? What is the idea that you choose? We've been called like social architects or humanitarian architects. I appreciate that. I don't want to like overly dismiss that label. I would not use that label on ourselves. I would say, what architecture is unhumanitarian? Like, what architecture is unsocial? I mean, what does that actually look like? And the notion that it's a sort of choice that you practice with an ethics or without an ethics is also a false choice. I mean, it's, the choice that, that you practice to affect society and that you practice to affect to build monuments to yourself is also, even for those who might even think they're doing that, is not real. I mean, that's a false choice as well, because, once this as an artist, once it goes into the world, it's doing many other things that are outside of your control, outside of what the intent is, outside of like the purpose for where it began and what it might work on. I mean, these are living things, actually. And especially, this is one of the other great lessons of the hospital, is it's a living, breathing entity. It's a living, breathing institution. It lives by how people use it and change it every single day and reconfigure it every single day. And then it's breathing, like quite literally breathing to allow you to breathe as an individual. There's air moving through it and hindering and being hindered by the walls and the windows.
And we often forget that it's people that activate architecture, right? Architecture doesn't exist without people. It exists as objects in the landscape, but it's people that activate the building. So that's important to remember.
Yeah, totally. And people are activated by structures. Like they are collected, confined, liberated, and allowed to by the structures that they are in. And by the way, we spend like 90% of our lives inside of buildings. So the idea that they're not that they're separate somehow from the composition of our social order, I think is misleading. Actually, we have to kind of dig deeper into understanding how and in what way architecture is not just an art form, but it's a service. It's a deep social service that necessitates the access to fundamental rights and fundamental services that allows communities to thrive or to be hindered.
Yeah, this question of having to choose, right? Having to choose between serving the community or making a kind of a monument to yourself, let's say, beauty versus justice, right? Comes up quite a lot in your work, and I love the reference to the theorist Giancarlo De Carlo, right? Bread or roses, as he put it. Can you explain that a bit more, Michael? Like what's actually meant by bread and roses?
Yeah, I'll give your thanks, Stephen. This is in our recent book called Beauty is Justice.
Yeah.
But I was very influenced when I read about Giancarlo De Carlo. He's an Italian architect from the mid-century to late mid-century, and died in 2003, I believe, early 2000. And De Carlo was very politically active, and he was the kind of publisher and editor of a magazine called Space and Society that was published between 1976 until his death, until 2000.
And I believe also he worked on Casabella, right? Was it Casabella?
Editor at Casabella, that's correct. And he was part of Team 10, which we study Allison and Peter Smithson. He was sort of the Italian member. De Carlo, coming out of fascist Italy and being part of the resistance, I think was very informed by the ways in which processes of architecture could change the way we think about what we build and why we build. And he wrote in his sort of first editorial that it was written about him that he had kind of been awakened to this idea when an editor at Casabella magazine posed this question to him, which was, if you could choose one, bread or roses, would you choose? And he posed that question to him, and then De Carlo kind of famously sort of molded over, and he said, well, I guess I would choose bread, sustenance versus beauty. And he went home and the story goes, was very frustrated by the question. He went back and he said, I think I'm very annoyed by that question. I think it's the wrong question. I think you're confusing ends with means. You're you're creating a dichotomy which is false. Beauty is the process through which we create space that emerges as transcendent. Bread is that process. It's that making and the construction. That architecture is not the creation of single and unique forms. When we focus on that, he said, we ignore a very broad spectrum of impacts of which the built environments shape our lives. And I think very presciently mentioned in 1976, by focusing on the narrow band of the spectrum of form, we leave architecture up to megalomania and social and political indifference, he said, in 1976, which could very much describe the kind of starchitect era that we found ourselves in, as you mentioned, the kind of pure fusing of architecture with capital that we saw, the kind of pre-2008 era. Now, I don't want to say every architect who was part of that period believed in that, but I mean, that is the kind of neoliberal, kind of market-driven architectural modality that we found ourselves in at the kind of height of that era before 2008 collapse. And so not only was this a sort of place of deep reflection, it was a kind of existential moment as well, I think, across the world around what is the role of the built environment. I was deeply searching for a kind of precedent of others who had wrestled with that. And I found it in a lot in the kind of post-war era. But even De Carlo's references, and he would go back to Morris and Florence Nightingale and Isambard Brunel, and people that were thinking about the same existential moments at their own moments of crisis. We are in, of course, another moment of crisis at the moment, and we're seeing great existential thinking about what our purpose is. And I would just say the last thing I'll say is, and this goes to something Christian mentioned before, in all of those moments we've seen, some folks build and think about using architecture as a method. And we've seen other architects paralyzed by the weight of the overwhelming pressure that the social and political might land on to architecture. And I try to encourage in dialogue that like we have to pull out of the paralysis. We have to act, we have to build, you have to put something in the ground, no matter how impossible it is to control it, in order to understand its impact, in order to push and iterate and go forward. Instead of being paralyzed and only critiquing what we see, we lose the ability to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And so the false dichotomy that you're describing is the one that, for the most part, drives the education of architects and the practices in relation to capital, especially in America. And I'm thinking about the ways that your practice, having kind of foot in two very different worlds, right? In Rwanda, which is a really different society than, and then in America, which is a really different society from each other. So I'm wondering the ways in which the practice that evolved principally in Rwanda then seeks to kind of activate itself in a really different context like America. Can you talk about the differences and the challenges that you face there?
Yeah, Christian, why don't you handle that, and I can chime in after this one.
This tag team thing is working, huh?
Sure. I mean, I guess I think this notion of the false choice, like in trying to like wrestle with that, we come to understand that, as Michael mentioned, that the answer is not to focus on how to form a better choice, but what process that we go through to not have to choose.
Yeah.
And that is what has led us to focus less about being right about the choice, but more about being right and consistent with the process that allows us to reframe the question before it's even asked. On the image that Michael is showing, for instance, is the color treatment center in Haiti. Funny you asked about the involvement of mass in Rwanda, and I'm giving you an example of Haiti.
Nice.
Not that I want to draw like, but I think that shows like maybe our cunningness in avoiding to make the choices that we asked with. But this example like starts to point to a way of thinking that allows us to step back and say what it is important here. What should we choose to do? Cholera was very foreign to Haiti. It was introduced. That's a fact that is known. But the response to it was very familiar, because the moment these conditions that we are used to are presented to us, and when these pandemics strike and we are in this moment of fear, as Michael mentioned, we automatically result to the things that we've done in the past that we know work or don't work. We don't care at that time, but we just want to get, I think, like the instant gratification that we've intervened, we've done something.
I was also in Haiti, I think around that same time, 2008, after the earthquake. I went with the Clinton Global Initiative to kind of assess which artisan groups and which craftspeople may be in a position to receive grants. And as I think about how your practice has expanded to incorporate projects in various places all over the world, and clearly serving a need in a place like Haiti, I'm just reminded of the stark poverty and the kind of the other severe needs that were going on there. And there's a quote, I believe, in your book where you were asked, don't we need more beds? Don't we need more medicine? Instead of just, pretty buildings, quote unquote. And obviously this could be a critique leveled against architecture firms that drop in and obviously, leave a very, in this case in Haiti, a very contemporary, very beautiful structure, which is also doing good, because you're not coping with that. But how do you argue against that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and I think I wouldn't even call it a critique, because all those questions are valid, and I think that's the most important thing to understand. Like, all those questions are valid.
Yeah.
But it is the ways in which we understand and argue about the need for certain things against the others. If every design decision we make is purely based on sculptural beauty, as we're pointing out earlier, and then they become indefensible in the face of some of those challenging questions. But when we are able, through the process of design, to articulate why every decision matters to the desired outcomes that these same people asking these questions actually want to achieve, then it becomes much easier.
Yeah.
So we talk about hospitals, and you find that the majority of the people that we work with when you're approaching hospital projects are people who deeply care about healthcare. And in moments where there are doubts that we are not working towards a common goal, that's when we start losing or not having answers to those questions. But the moment we start talking about their language and demonstrate that the architecture, both as a process and the outcomes, is contributing directly to help them achieve what they want to achieve, then it becomes a separate conversation. Even though the architecture, yes, it is still beautiful, it has to be beautiful, and yet also all the decisions that are made do have a functional, defensible reason why it should exist to help them achieve what they want to achieve.
It's back to this question of beauty is justice, right? Justice is beauty. So and dignity, right? So I guess I'm wondering, how do you design for dignity? How is that? I mean, what's the equation that gets us to a design for dignity? Because this is a very different way of looking at the world, right? And looking at the built environment.
That's a very difficult question, and I don't think I necessarily have the answer to. Right. And if I had it, it would be the secret ingredient that I would not be willing to share publicly. But it's a good question. I think we don't. I wouldn't say that you design for dignity, but we invest in a process of design that seeks to uphold the dignity all the way. And when you do that, it's easy to confidently claim that the outcome would obviously be justified to hold the dignity.
Yeah,
that's the best way I can answer it. Michael, jump in.
A bit about what we mean by dignity. I think it's good. Maybe it's useful to frame that question within our understanding of what does dignity mean in design, because it can be used in a lot of different ways. But a good friend of mine, John Kerry, has said if health is to medicine and justice is to law, then dignity is to design. It is the essence of what design produces in that formation. And when you say what is dignity, well, there's I think really two ways to think about dignity, at least I think through the lens of design. The first is the feeling that you as an individual matter, that I have been made important, even my individual self, within this greater infrastructure, which is meant to serve so many undefined publics. The great dichotomy of architecture is that it has to serve the public. It has to serve the individual, the infinite and the intimate. This challenge of both of those levels, I think, is what's so amazing about architecture. And great architecture achieves that. You know, when you touch a handle that Alvar Aalto designed, when you walk into one of his buildings, you see, you touch the handcrafted wood railing, and you feel the same floor plan that you have the building that you're walking in with what you touch. I mean, there's a sense that your experience as an individual has been carried through the entire project, and it's at each moment there's a moment of discovery and awakening and awareness, and that you as an individual matter. The perception, the walk through, the framing of space. These are things that design thinks about: texture, composition, smell, you know, audibility, sound, light. And great design considers like the whole person. That's dignity. The other way, and is the service of design. And that's why also that when a building only serves the bare minimum, only serves the kind of cheapest, most affordable, most basic necessity of the building, like a box, a concrete box, basically, it doesn't serve the whole person. It's not serving dignity. It might be serving function, but not dignity. This is an important distinction. And that's where it gets into the other way to read dignity, which is a right. Dignity as a right is actually codified in law, not in America, but like in Germany. When Germany said that the right to dignity is one of the fundamental rights that their new constitution after World War II, after like recovering and trying to cope with the Holocaust, they instituted dignity as a fundamental right in their constitution. And that has changed their approach to the built environment fundamentally. It's changed their approach to incarceration. It's changed their approach to educational facilities. It's changed their approach to the way they think about public facilities. You know, dignity as a right, that we have a right to dignity, can be a foundational tenet to how we understand the investment in public resources made possible or made manifest through space. So it goes back to a question of access. You know, why is it that in the kind of merging of the market, you know, the neoliberal market with architecture, that only, you know, fewer and fewer communities had access to that full scope of services, the best that we can provide in the built environment? It's not a question of, I don't think that's only a critique of the egomaniacal architect or like the ludicrousness of.
Michael, I think you're frozen, or maybe I am. Hello?
No, I think it's on Michael's end.
I mean, obviously brilliant points, and there's so many places we could end up in that conversation. It takes me both to the use of craft in your work, right? Michael talked about the Alvar Aalto handle and the ways in which those kinds of details are reminders to the individual that they're being considered. And I think about how many of your projects in Rwanda have literally been hand-built. And I'm wondering, Christian, can you talk a little bit about, and congratulations on mass build, by the way, finally being at the stage where it is, and it's an additional service that can be offered by Mass Design Group. But Christian, can you talk a little bit about the ways in which Mass considers craft and as a kind of direct supplier of dignity at the level of the individual?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think like Michael started touching on these to try to explain like the many, aspects, approaches that we need to invest in the dignity of the people. And I just saw like someone posted, I think Natasha, thank you for posting the 4 types of dignity in the chat message. This is very inspiring because and she's right that when we we think about architecture as not this single single dimension intervention, but a process in which there are multiple touch points and opportunities to create that connection that seeks to establish and uphold the dignity of individuals and the communities that we work with, then everything that we do becomes a point of investigation to understand what more our capabilities, our trade, if I can call it that way, our technical knowledge could be utilized to create these opportunities that individuals, communities could find ways they could feel connected to the work that we do. And that being a primary motivation, welcome back, Michael.
Welcome back.
Then we do want to figure out, based on the communities we are working with, what are the existing opportunities that will allow us to utilize, yes, you know, they could be simply described as locally fabricated or economic empowerment, like, you know, the normal kind of like expressions and jargon that we have created to understand certain complex phenomenon. But the end result, I think, is what we are more looking for, is that feeling that the Masons describes when you talk to them in their stories about being proud of the stone cladding that they've created. It's that it's those stories about how like that employment for over like the construction period has allowed them to reach a point of prosperity that they were either looking for, and that made them feel important and that progressing in life. It's not about like us taking the credit that our building has the lowest embodied carbon because we did not import everything from China, but it's more about finding, I don't know how I can call it, like not like quantitative measure of satisfaction, but the qualitative part of it that ultimately can be traced back to the dignity of individuals or the communities, or what do we achieve together, or where we get if we achieve these collective efforts.
And you know, I have to speak in the first person here because I've been lucky enough to have visited a few of your sites in Rwanda. I've been to the Butaro Hospital, and the way that hand chiseled wall of stone communicates not just a sense of quality in terms of the tectonic of a stone wall, but also the foundation for a quality experience at the hospital. And it reverberates in a way that is, as Michael was saying, spatial, right? And as you were saying, qualitative, but also speaks to the local nature of what the artisans are capable of. And I think that's really important. I'm curious about the ways in which that translates to your projects here in America, where you have a different, a more industrial context to work within. How do you develop these kind of details in America and your American projects?
Yeah, well, maybe I can. Sorry, I got kicked off there. Sorry about that, everybody. I'm sure Christian is much better to hear from than I am anyway. So I think that, you know, maybe your question about fabrication, you know, it's an important one about materiality and craft, but I think it's also philosophically, you know, back to Giancarlo DiCarlo and others, it's a question of a kind of moral positioning that is becoming more and more evident. You know, William Morris said that we can never make a craft without consideration of the laborer. And the idea that arts and crafts at that period of time in the 1880s was a political act, was about investing in place against industrialization, against the kind of alienation of the system taking over the kind of social order. That was a moment in time, which I think is important for us to reflect on now, because we're having a similar situation.
Yeah.
And I think there are other precedents in other fields that we can look to. So take, for example, the slow food movement. The slow food movement has done such a good job for the last 50 years, really 40 years, and in particular the last 20 years, saying everything that you eat, everything that you put on your plate, every 3 times a day, it's a choice. It's a choice that you're making about the environment, about your local economy, about your local agricultural community. It's a choice about what you put into your body, about your your health, where you're investing your money. It's a choice. And those choices, we have to understand them as rich and complex. And that if we tie provenance, place, and the makers of that apple that you're eating, those who grew it, the materials that they used to grow it, the fertilizer, the farmer, if we are able to bind identity and place and provenance to that thing that you're eating, you're connected to those things. It's not alienated from you. It's actually bound to you. I think that same issue is happening in the built environment. So we call this a slow food movement of the built environment, the slow space movement, that you have to choose material that is bound to place and proximity. And while we learned that in Rwanda, because to some degree it was required. I mean, we didn't really have access to buying all our furniture and importing it. It was too expensive. It'd be cheaper to make it ourselves. I think that same philosophy resonates with us locally, anywhere in Boston, nationally, and globally. I mean, we're doing stuff in Bangladesh and Vietnam.
But clearly,
some principles happen. Same principles are related there. That we as designers have a choice, and you make these same investments in your incredible work, Stephen. It's like we choose who the craftsmen are going to make this and where the material is going to be coming from. And those are deeply political and social choices, but they're also inspiring choices to bind us into a greater cultural connection to the dignity of work, right? And to the maximization of value over what we're touching in the world.
Yeah, no, really good points, Michael. And of course, I'm right there with you with the slow food movement. It's a great inspiration for me as well. But I think you touched upon a couple of things that I think are worth commenting on. This choice that we talk about obviously is a luxury, and I think it's worth remembering that most people in the world may not have that choice, may not be able to choose the best, let's say, quality over just sustenance, right? And so it takes me to the work of Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative, and something that he said: the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, right? The opposite of poverty is justice. And so when we think about the choices that people have to make in terms of quality versus just life, I think that statement is a very powerful one. And maybe we can talk a little bit about your collaboration with Bryan Stevenson and Equal Justice Initiative.
Sure. Want to take this on?
Christian, are you there?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I'm here. I can begin and let Michael continue. So it's indeed a powerful way of looking at things. One of the things that maybe I want to point out to is that our justice work, our work in the justice space, is very much inspired by the lessons we learned from the history of Rwanda here, and the kind of lessons we've learned as a country first, when we were dealing with the aftermath of the 1994 genocide against Tutsis. So a few things came from, like, understanding that injustice that happened in this country. I think the idea of branding someone an enemy because for, I don't know, people told you to so, or these things are, I'm not going to lecture on about genocide ideology, but whatever reasons that someone is branded as an enemy and dehumanized so much that they get slaughtered without any questions being asked is a very dangerous idea. And like thinking that that idea, even though it was maybe extremely showcased in the case of the genocide in against Tutsis in Rwanda, it's a phenomenon that we live with in our daily lives that we just don't realize. And organizations like eco-justice initiatives have been very vocal around bringing this awareness to the world, especially in the United States, where they say that we have to be very careful with certain things that we say and do to avoid reaching that point where we start dehumanizing people. We strip them of that dignity and start thinking them as not humans. And
Absolutely.
they did this very thorough and incredible research to demonstrate moments in the history of the United States where this has been done over and over again, to a point where we now consider it as history that we feel like we understand, but we don't fully understand how it dehumanizes to accept it the way it is. And in trying to understand like the role the design can play in addressing that space of justice, it's very important for us to understand that the space that can allow us to interact with that type of like nature of ourselves has also the power to contribute to the healing that we badly need. And the design can play a role in setting up the spaces that can allow us to do that. Absolutely. In many ways, in all aspects of the process that we discussed earlier today.
Absolutely. And it's so important. I think about Brian Stevenson's work and other statements that he's made that get straight to the heart of us, especially in this country and other countries around the world that have struggled in similar ways, to remember the pain, to remember the suffering, and not to suppress it, but to live with it. I just want to read, speaking of, now we're looking at an image of the Memorial for Peace and Justice in, remind me of the city, Christian?
Montgomery, Alabama.
Montgomery, Alabama, of course. I just want to read a little statistic here that many people may not be aware of. Between 1877 and 1950, there were 4,400 Black men, women, and children known to have been lynched in America, which averages out to about one lynching per week for 73 years. And this kind of terror it's hard to imagine if you haven't lived through it. It's hard to imagine that was possible, and that was a regular circumstance, that people had to live with that. So, when I think about how we express that in the built environment, how we memorialize that, I wonder how a memorial like this one has to kind of abstract the reality in order to confront it. Can you speak to some of the design decisions that went into this project with the Equal Justice Initiative?
Yeah, I'll let Michael take this one on. I can compliment later.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I mean, I would I would just first off say I think Brian Stevenson is the designer here. This idea that we spatialize this trauma and bring and create a kind of pilgrimage site to it is, I think, it's not only a kind of spatial decision, a radical design idea that is predicated on lessons I think we do learn from Germany, but also from Rwanda. Rwanda has spent significant resources spatializing the loss and the horror of the genocide throughout, like I don't want to say every community, but in many communities, many villages, hamlets, small intersections, there are memorials to those killed in those communities. And the community came together to build those spaces of memory. Some of them are just marking, some of them are more, symbolic and commemorative and collective, and some, like the National Memorial, are kind of vast and rich and traumatic in their own right to kind of live through that and experience it. I think it's worth noting that's an investment in space that is required in order to begin that moment of truth and reconciliation, that kind of national reckoning around exhuming the truth and not being able to look away. And we learned a lot from Rwanda and the way in which memorialization was happening there. In particular, I want to point to, and Christian can speak about this, the sort of annually, the first week of April, which is the Memorial Week, there has been a kind of ritualized kind of reclaiming of remains that are found in communities and brought to an open grave at the National Memorial. And that is almost like every year ritualizing that loss and ritualizing that memory, that bringing something with us to contribute. That idea of participation, I think, is really what drove a lot of this memorial. And
maybe, Michael, before you continue, I want to interject with just one comment.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that, when as a community, some of these things that we're uncomfortable with happen, we tend to bury them in two ways. One is with time, so we bury them in the past. And the other way is through space. We erase any indication in the spaces around us that remind us of those, dark memories. And I think what Michael is starting to point out today is that, there was a commitment nationwide to not let any of those two things happen. So he mentioned about the erection of memorials in many different communities and places where like these things took place as a constant reminder for people who happen to be in those spaces at that point in time. But there's also like a ritualization every year at a time where we have to pause almost everything and take us a little bit back in that time and remember that those horrific moments are an inseparable part of our identity moving forward.
Yes.
And we need to actively do something every day to address those injustices in any form of our practices that could lead to those injustices. And I think when Michael talks about the design decisions for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, I think you'll start finding like some examples and things like how this was achieved through this project. Sorry, Michael, to interrupt.
Well, I'm also sorry because I can't believe this is maybe not the best moment to to be running out of time. I had no idea. I have to admit, I really I've been so immersed in our conversation that I've lost track of time. you and I, the three of us could continue this conversation for another hour, I'm sure, and we'd have listeners for it. I only hope that the great work that you've been doing continues to grow in America in ways that we can reach the level of kind of daily recognition of the importance of our history and our identities going forward, especially during these difficult times. I'd like to, I don't believe, I'm checking quickly to see if we had any questions in the chat, but I believe we answered them. So there are obviously a lot more questions I could ask both of you. Michael and Christian, maybe a last few words, if we could stop the screen sharing.
I'll just say thank you, Stephen, and thanks all of you for joining us this morning. And I mean, we do a lot of lectures, but I've never had such a great dialogue. So really, thanks for holding force on the design and dialogue. I really appreciate it. I mean, we're obviously so inspired by your work, and I'm sure so many on this phone who also care deeply about our role as designers, as do we. And we don't have an answer. Obviously, we maybe a hypothesis about one way to go. I mean, what I'm encouraged by is that there is so many architects, designers, people in the spatial disciplines who are asking that question, like, what can we do to participate more directly in serving our communities, and be open to the possibilities and the failings of that service. And I think I'm also encouraged by one other thing I'll say, which is the work in the spatial disciplines is on a long time horizon. I said this when we had some political change a few years ago that many in our office a lot of us were quite upset about. I said, remember, if you make a decision today, it'll be built in like 5 years when this administration has been changed, most likely. And we're making decisions for a future we can't even predict fully to be a part of, which I think also helps pull us out of the urgency of now into the kind of necessity of tomorrow in so many ways. And it's our responsibility to be thinking always on the horizon, like very far in the horizon. And we're kind of burdened by that responsibility as designers and architects. But I think also liberated by that, because we have to think in a cycle that isn't necessarily within the political cycle. It gets us deep into the essential core of questions of human dignity, rights, service, health, our physiology, and our belief in creating spaces where we can thrive as individuals. So I think there's for me, I come back to that all the time when faced with great headwinds. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Christian. It's been great. And let's look toward the horizon, and the long term. Absolutely. I appreciate it. I just want a couple of last words. I'll be on again next week, next Wednesday.